Hey everyone, this is a straightforward guide to help set up your HOTAS or joystick in War Thunder with a focus on jets. I noticed that on YouTube all the videos were focused on the World War II planes. As War Thunder continues to lean more into modern jets, the keymapper naturally gets more complicated, simply because the more modern planes are more capable and can do more things than prop planes. This video is focused on breaking down the keymapper and helping to translate what each keymap does so you can decide for yourself what you need and don't need. If this is your first time here, this channel focuses on multiplayer sim gameplay, so if you're into that, please subscribe. First thing first is let us acknowledge that the keymapper came to War Thunder before this dramatic increase in capabilities by the more modern War Thunder planes. I just mentioned this because players seem really confused by the keymapper, and I think this is normal. The keymapper is quite complicated and it is very different from other games, so don't feel flustered. You will be able to use your fancy joystick by the end of this video. Let us begin by making a play area where we can begin to keymap. Pick a suitable airplane. The easiest way to do this is to just right click one from your tech tree and click test fly. Note, if you do not have a jet yet, you can take a premium jet and test fly that one. Make sure you have missiles armed, and then also I would recommend we start in air realistic battles because it makes things easier to validate that your keymapper is working as you have more of a response from the GUI. If you can get it working in ARB, then you can get it working in Sim or Arcade easily. From here, we can go into the actual keymapper by hitting escape, then controls. Make sure you are on aircraft on the top left. From here, we have a big decision. You can use the control setup wizard, and this helps to populate some controls, but if you have a higher end HOTAS like a VKB or Verpal setup, things will not commonly map to the right thing automatically. Instead, we will go line by line, and I will illustrate the important ones so you have a full understanding. Okay, so we are on aircraft and realistic controls for now. Let's start at throttle axis. This is a self-explanatory one. It controls your engine. Double click into this and then you are presented with this screen. The first thing is to identify what axis we want. I want this on my throttle, on the main throw, or the main axis. What you will want to do is try to find that axis in this list. As you can see, I have a more complicated HOTAS as I have many devices. So I just need to find the right one. You will notice you are on the right one when you see these icons move as you're moving your throttle. The icons being at the far right mean that the throttle is at max, while all the way to the left means that the engines are at idle. If you find that the red and green icons are opposite, you can invert the controls if you wish. Red is where your real life throttle is, while green is the input in the game. These other options will fine-tune the axis. I generally do not add any dead zones or linearity. Dead zones are useful if you have a loose axis and want the input to only engage after you have pushed past a certain point. Hold throttle for WEP we want off as we have a throttle. The next are the basic control surfaces. Roll makes your plane roll, pitch is nose up and down, and yaw is your rudder or left and right. These are what make your plane actually move. All of these should be on your stick except for yaw, where you can have this on rudder pedals if you wish. Thrust vector is useful for planes like the Harrier, which lets you begin to hover, while hover height allows you to pick the altitude that you wish to hover at. I do not fly these planes in War Thunder, so I can't speak much about them, but hey, they're nice to have if you do like VTOL planes. Skipping ahead, we get into wing sweep. I have set this to an axis which lets you control the exact sweep level of your wings. This is useful for planes like the MiG-23 and the F-14. Now you may notice that you can't move your wings despite rolling this axis around. This is where the next keymap comes into play. This is switch wing sweep control mode. By pressing this, you can switch from auto or to manual. Now to go back to the wing sweep axis, let's talk about a situation where you may not have enough axes to use. Maybe you have a HOTAS, but it's not one that is fully tricked out, that has a spare axis to dedicate toward this more niche control. If that is the case, then you can set it up to a button push. To do this, you will input your positive and negative keymaps here and then turn on relative control. This will let you use two buttons instead of having an axis with two ends. Now we get into the flap controls. F will toggle between different modes like combat or takeoff. The flaps up and down is another one. I typically use flaps up and down so I can control it via directions and not toggle between modes. Please note that jets typically have less flaps controls than World War II props, where you could actually precisely set how much degrees you want. Toggle air brake. This is useful one to have to slow yourself down. This is a great way to make overshoots happen or to stay within certain G limits. Skipping over thrust reversal, which is not necessary, we get to gear controls. These are pretty self-explanatory. For brakes, I just use B, as taxiing is very minimal or non-existent in this game. Lastly is drag chute, which deploys a parachute behind your plane after you have landed to help you slow down faster. It's a nice to have but not necessary on the HOTAS. P is an easy one to remember. At this point, we have now finished the ability to control the aircraft via the control surfaces. We can now transition into the weapons. If you have a two-stage trigger, I would recommend having small caliber on your first step and secondary and additional on your second step. If you think of a BF-109, your small caliber are your pea shooters and your nose caliber, and your large caliber is the cannon on your nose. For jets, you typically only have cannons. The issue is that some planes only have gun pods and no internal guns like the F4. So my recommendation should cover you across both World War II and jets. If you only have a single stage trigger, then you will probably want to map all three onto the same trigger pool. Now, the next part is a bit complicated, so stay with me for a bit. Unfortunately, War Thunder, as of the last patch and getting a new throttle, is making my joystick commands pop up like an Xbox controller. Not sure why, but rest assured I am using my VK base stick. So with that said, we are going to take some shortcuts here to make things as easy as possible. Fire primary weapon and secondary weapon can be mapped to act as your pickle buttons or the weapon release button in DCS, to make another comparison to another game. Secondary weapon is the one you will want to use for things like missiles, bombs, or pylon based weapons. I choose not to set up my controls this way. If you want to do it, then set it up that way. It's easy. What I have chosen to do is to have a dedicated button press for each weapon type. I have found this to be useful as War Thunder battles can get quite hectic, and I want to make sure I have safeguards to make sure I deploy the right weapon. These controls are all self-explanatory because they tell you what they will use. So again, the choice is either to use a universal secondary weapon button, or like a pickle button, or dedicated button for each weapon type. Now let's try to map air-to-air weapons. For basic IR missiles, you really only need two buttons. One is fire air-to-air missile and switch secondary weapon. You start out by pressing the switch secondary weapon to select the weapon that you want. You will see in the top left what you have selected. From there, you can press the fire button. From there, you can press the fire air-to-air missile button. This will turn on the seeker head, and because we are in air RB, you can see the circle that appears. This is the scan area of the seeker head. If you get close enough to a target and have enough of an IR signature, it will turn red. In sim battles, you do not have this cone, but you have the seeker head tone. From here, you can then press the secondary weapon button or the fire air-to-air missile button again. This is a good example of why I do not use the secondary weapon button for everything. If you use fire air-to-air missile button like me, then you basically only need two key maps to fire an IR missile. You press fire air-to-air missile once to start the seeker head process, and then you press it again to fire once you have tone. Drop additional fuel tanks. This is useful if you want to min-max. You can take low fuel into a match and bring a fuel tank. Then when you enter into the merge, you dump the fuel tank and are in the fight at a really low weight because you have less internal fuel. I'm going to brush past the air-to-ground stuff because they are very self-explanatory, so I will just confirm what each one is. Weapon lock, air-to-ground. This is for manual guided missiles like the RB-05 or Bullpup. And the secondary weapon ripple lets you pick how many bombs you will drop. Then we get to countermeasures. Fire countermeasures deploys once, and periodic is a continual one. Both are useful to have. We also have two more options here that are pretty unique. The IRCM is an IR jammer. This is not really on a lot of jets, so this is not going to apply to a lot of you. The MAW option is a missile warning system, and when it detects a launch, it will automatically deploy countermeasures. Yaw and pitch axis for aimed weapons is to steer weapons, and these are really useful for air-to-ground. Target laser designator is for planes like the Su-25 that have a laser designator on the nose to help aiming of laser-based weapons. Now we get into the IRST or IRST and radar controls. By default, you start in radar. This key map lets you go into IRST mode. This is an interesting mode because it is using an aircraft-based IR sensor instead of relying on the seeker head of the missile. This allows you to pick up locks at a greater range than your missile seeker heads while not alerting the enemy. This is especially great for medium range IR missiles like the R-24T. This will probably become even more important as the flanker is being introduced in War Thunder, so the R-27T will probably also rely on the system. The next key map lets you change the mode on the sensor you are using, either radar or IRST. This topic is a large one and a bigger one than this video. There are different modes to IRST and radar, and there are pros and cons to each one. The next one allows you to quickly go between BVR and within visual range modes. Basically, if you get into a merge and need to lock someone right in front of you, you will want to have this map. It also lets you switch back to your normal BVR mode when you are done with the fight. The next one changes the search mode. This has a big effect on IRST for the Russian planes, as it focuses the scan range and makes it easier to scan a smaller area at a higher frequency. Scope scale changes the range of your radar. Maybe you do not want to see as far and just deal with things that are closer. This is useful. Select target to lock. This is a really important one. War Thunder matches get busy. You will frequently run into situations where you have two enemies in front of you. One may be cold and fast, a waste of a missile shot, while someone else is low and slow, an ideal missile shot. This lets you select between them in the radar and to lock the right one, which brings us to our next one, which is just that, how to lock. Now that we have seen a target locked, you can use secondary weapon switch to go to a radar-based missile and press the air-to-air missile launch button, and the radar missile will launch if you have a lock. One thing we left out here, and to double back real fast, is how to see things on the radar. We know how to manipulate it, but how do we make sure the radar is pointed at the right place? This is where these three controls come in. This allows you to manipulate the radar to look more left or right or up and down. This is critical to have because planes are moving all around, and you don't want to force yourself to move your plane to them. Instead, you want to move your radar at them. These are useful to have mapped on an axis, especially like a mini stick if you have one. Moving below, we have the sight stabilizer. This is useful for planes that have pods or sights mounted on them. This is useful for basically just air to ground. Congrats, you now have all the complicated maps for jets and War Thunder, and should be in a good position for any of the new jets coming into the game. The last few remaining ones that we skipped are air to ground ones, but these are really self-explanatory and can work well within the workflow that we established. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe. Additionally, if you are new to this channel and like this, I encourage you to check out the other videos. We cover a lot of sim games here, like IL2 and DCS, and etc. If you think I forgot anything, please let me know in the comments below so that the new players can learn from you. Thanks and have a good one.